All right, so you wanted to talk about trauma and how it impacts more than just the person who experiences it directly,
Yeah.
like ripples, right,
Uh-huh.
spreading out to their families and friends and
And
the whole
communities.
support system, really. We're
Yeah.
calling this secondary wounding today. And using this source, which focuses on parents and guardians of kids who've been through trauma.
It's amazing how often we focus all the energy on the initial trauma and forget about the ripple effects.
Totally.
Like everyone around them is going through it too.
Right.
And this secondary wounding adds another layer of pain on top of everything else.
Okay, so how does that work?
Well, it's all about the things people say and do, usually with good intentions.
But they end up making things worse.
Yeah, like trying to be helpful, but actually hindering the healing process.
And this source actually has a secondary wounding checklist to help people avoid saying the wrong things.
Right.
It's kind of wild to think there's a whole checklist for this.
Well, it's important to raise awareness,
Yeah.
because even small comments can have a huge impact.
Okay, so give me an example.
Imagine a parent trying to deal with their child's trauma, and someone says, well, you need to put this in perspective.
Oof, that's rough.
Right. On the surface, it sounds reasonable, but...
But to that parent, it's like saying their pain isn't valid.
Exactly.
Like they shouldn't be feeling what they're feeling.
Yeah, and the source emphasizes that secondary wounding can be just as damaging as physical wounds,
Really?
sometimes even more so,
Why is that?
because it often comes from a place of betrayal.
Especially when it's coming from loved ones.
Right, you're already dealing with the trauma itself, and then you get hit with judgment or misunderstanding from the people you need the most.
It's got to be so hard.
It is, and there's a story in the source that really illustrates this. The story of Grandma Maddox.
Okay, tell me about her.
Well, her story is a perfect example of how unaddressed trauma can come back to haunt you years later.
Like it was just waiting for the right trigger.
Exactly. It's almost like an emotional echo.
What?
So her story starts with her son experiencing a medical trauma as a newborn.
Oh no.
He was in a coma for 3 months.
Just imagine the fear and anxiety she must have been going through.
It's heartbreaking, and on top of that, her husband left her, and her own mother blamed her for what happened.
What?
Yeah, you can see how the lack of support just made her trauma worse.
Absolutely.
And then years later, when her granddaughter needed surgery, all those feelings came rushing back.
It's like the initial trauma was lying dormant, just waiting to be reactivated.
Exactly. And it shows how healing from trauma isn't a straight line.
There can be setbacks and triggers along the way.
All the time.
So how did Grandma Maddox cope with all of this?
Well, the source describes these drawing activities that she used to process her experience.
Interesting.
It's a testament to the therapeutic power of art,
Yeah, like expressing things that are hard to put into words.
Exactly. And in her first drawing, she drew a baby, but without arms.
Oh, wow.
That's a powerful image, right?
It is.
It represents her feeling powerless, with her son in a coma and everyone blaming her.
It makes sense.
And she also included a phone in the drawing.
A phone.
Yeah, it symbolized the fear she felt every time it rang, like waiting for bad news.
I get it.
And it also represented her isolation,
Wow.
her lack of support from her family.
So the phone became this symbol of her anxiety and the breakdown of her support system.
Exactly.
And the act of drawing all of this out, did that help her?
Absolutely. The source says that putting it all down on paper brought her a sense of relief and understanding.
Like giving those feelings a physical form?
Right. And the source also talks about another woman named Tina, whose experience with trauma was very different.
Oh, how so?
Well, Tina's story is all about the sudden and shocking trauma of suicide.
That's so difficult to deal with.
It is, and in her case, her husband took his own life, leaving her to deal with the grief and the impact on their children.
On top of her own grief.
Yes, and as if that wasn't enough, she also experienced secondary wounding from her husband's family.
Oh no, what did they do?
They blamed her for his suicide, saying things like, maybe if you hadn't.
How could they?
It's incredibly hurtful, and it completely ignores the complexity of grief, especially when it comes to suicide.
Instead of support, they added guilt and shame.
Exactly, and it shows how important it is to approach grieving people with sensitivity and a desire to support, not to judge.
You're so right.
And just like Grandma Maddox, Tina found solace in art.
Really?
She was able to confront the really difficult details of her experience, the things that were hard to talk about, through drawing.
It's interesting how art can be such a powerful tool for processing trauma.
It is, and in cases of suicide, the grieving process is even more complex.
Why is that?
Because there's so many unanswered questions, the struggle to understand such a devastating act.
It's like a whole other layer of pain and confusion.
Exactly. And art can be a way to express those emotions that are too hard to put into words.
That makes sense. And the source emphasizes the importance of trauma-informed support,
Yeah.
recognizing that everyone copes differently.
Right. There's no one-size-fits-all approach.
And they introduce this concept of resilience and a tool called the Victim Survivor Thrive Chart.
I love that chart. It shows that healing isn't just about being a victim or a survivor. It's a journey with many stages.
So tell me about the stages.
Okay, so in the victim stage, there's a lot of why me and feelings of powerlessness.
That's natural, right?
Absolutely. It's that initial shock and overwhelm.
And then what?
Then, as people move into the survivor stage, they start taking back control.
They confront the trauma and start moving forward,
Exactly. And the ultimate goal is to reach the thrive stage.
where they're not just coping, but using their experience for positive change.
Right. It's not about erasing the past, but integrating it into their lives in a way that allows them to grow.
That's so hopeful. It means that even after trauma, there's potential for healing and even positive transformation.
Absolutely. And speaking of inspiring journeys, the source tells the story of a young woman named Michelle.
Okay, what's her story?
Well, Michelle's story shows that there's no one right way to heal from trauma.
We all need different things.
Yeah, and she went through multiple traumas in her life. Abuse, neglect, sexual assault, you name it.
That's a lot to carry.
It is, and at first, she resisted traditional talk therapy.
It wasn't helpful for her.
No, which happens a lot,
Talking about trauma can be incredibly difficult.
It can, and it highlights the need for different therapeutic approaches.
To meet people where they're at.
Exactly, and for Michelle, what really helped was the SITC CAP program.
What's that?
It uses sensory activities and drawing to process trauma.
So it's not just about talking.
Right, and there's this incredible moment described in the source where she finally felt able to draw her anger
How did she depict it?
as flames, and she called it her magical moment because it brought her so much relief.
It's like by giving her anger a visual form, she found a way to release it.
Exactly, and that release, that shift in perspective, is often a turning point in healing.
Wow, this has been quite a journey. From secondary wounding to the power of art and the different ways people cope with trauma.
It has.
What stands out to you the most from all of this?
I think the biggest takeaway for me is that healing from trauma isn't a linear process.
It's a journey with ups and downs.
Absolutely, and everyone copes differently.
So we need to meet people where they are and offer support that empowers them.
Exactly, and we can't impose our own expectations on how someone should heal.
It's about creating a safe and supportive space for them to find their own path forward.
Absolutely, and this reminds me of another powerful story from the source material, the story of Zara. She experienced severe trauma as a child, and for years she carried this weight of shame and guilt. It wasn't until she discovered a community art therapy program that she started to find some relief.
That's interesting you mentioned community because this source really emphasizes that healing often happens in relationships. It's not just about individual therapy, it's about having those support systems in place.
Absolutely. The source talks about creating environments that are conducive to healing.
Like safe spaces where people feel heard and understood.
Yeah, and not just in therapy settings, but in their families, communities, even workplaces.
The source specifically talks about the role of teachers in creating those safe spaces for kids who've experienced trauma.
Yeah, teachers are often on the front lines seeing the effects of trauma in their classrooms.
Right.
They can be incredible sources of stability and encouragement for kids who are struggling.
It makes me think about how trauma ripples outward, impacting everyone around the person who experienced it directly.
It does.
And that means we all have a responsibility to become more trauma-informed, don't you think?
Absolutely. The more we understand about trauma and its impact, the better equipped we are to respond in ways that support healing instead of hindering it.
You know, another point that stuck with me from the source was this idea that healing isn't about erasing the pain of the past.
Yeah.
It's about integrating those experiences into our lives in a way that allows us to move forward.
That's such an important distinction. It's not about pretending the trauma didn't happen or minimizing its impact.
Right.
It's about finding ways to make meaning of it, to learn from it, and to use it as a catalyst for growth.
The source actually uses the term post-traumatic growth.
I love that term.
Like even after going through something horrific, there's potential for positive change.
Absolutely. And it speaks to the remarkable resilience of the human spirit. So many people who've experienced trauma report profound shifts in their perspectives, a newfound appreciation for life, and even stronger relationships.
It's like they were broken open by the trauma,
Yeah.
but in the process, they discovered a hidden strength they never knew they had.
Exactly. And this brings us back to that victim, survivor, thrive model. It's about recognizing that the journey through trauma isn't always linear,
There will be setbacks, moments of despair,
but there will also be moments of incredible growth and transformation.
and every step forward, every moment of choosing hope over despair deserves to be celebrated.
It really does. It's a testament to the power of the human spirit to overcome adversity.
So how do we foster that resilience in ourselves and in those around us? How do we move from that victim mindset to a place of empowerment and growth?
Well, the source talks about the importance of creating environments that support healing, and it's not just about physical spaces.
Right.
It's about fostering a culture of empathy and understanding where people feel safe to share their experiences without judgment.
And being mindful of the language we use when talking about trauma.
Absolutely, we need to avoid phrases that minimize or dismiss someone's experience and
Right.
instead use language that validates their pain and acknowledges their strength.
The source also emphasized the importance of self-care, and not as a luxury, but as a necessity.
Self-care is crucial for building resilience. It's about prioritizing our well-being so we have the resources to navigate life's challenges.
And it's not just about bubble baths and face masks.
No, it's about anything that helps us replenish and recharge. Spending time in nature, connecting with loved ones, pursuing hobbies, whatever brings us joy and nourishes our souls.
It's about finding what truly sustains us and making it a priority.
And that's important not just for those who've experienced trauma, but for everyone.
We all need to replenish our reserves.
So we can show up for ourselves and for others.
The source also touched on the importance of early intervention and prevention.
Yes, teaching coping mechanisms, promoting emotional regulation, fostering healthy communication, these can all contribute to building resilience in children and adolescents.
It's much easier to address potential problems early on than to try to fix them later.
Absolutely. By equipping individuals with the tools they need to navigate difficult situations, we can help prevent trauma from having such a devastating impact.
And it's not just about preventing the initial trauma, but also preventing the secondary wounding that can happen afterward.
Right. We all need to become more aware of the subtle ways our words and actions can either support or hinder someone's healing journey.
It's about becoming more conscious of how we interact with others, especially those who've been through difficult experiences.
Yeah.
It strikes me that this concept of secondary wounding is something we don't talk about enough.
I agree. It's this hidden layer of pain that often gets overlooked.
And it's not just about avoiding hurtful comments.
Right.
It's also about offering the right kind of support.
Sometimes the best thing we can do is simply listen without judgment or offer a hug or a shoulder to cry on.
The source also points out that sometimes even well-meaning attempts at support can backfire.
Yeah, like trying to fix someone's problems or offering unsolicited advice can actually make them feel more helpless.
It's about respecting their agency and allowing them to find their own path forward.
And remembering that there's no one right way to heal. What works for one person might not work for another.
So a key takeaway here is the importance of empathy and understanding, putting ourselves in someone else's shoes and trying to see the world from their perspective.
Exactly, and recognizing that everyone's experience of trauma is unique, there's no room for comparison or judgment.
It's about creating a space where people feel safe to be vulnerable, to share their stories, and to receive support without feeling like they have to put on a brave face.
And this goes beyond individual interactions. It's
Yeah.
about creating a more trauma-informed culture where we acknowledge the prevalence of trauma and its impact on individuals, families, and communities.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what are your final thoughts on all of this? What do you hope our listeners will take away from this conversation?
For me, it's the reminder that we're all interconnected. The trauma that one person experiences can ripple outward, affecting those around them. And that means we all have a responsibility to create a more compassionate and supportive world.
And that starts with awareness,
Yeah.
recognizing the signs of trauma, understanding the impact of secondary wounding, and committing to being a source of support rather than judgment.
And it's about having those difficult conversations, breaking the stigma surrounding trauma, and creating spaces where people feel safe to talk about their experiences without shame.
It's a lot to think about, but it feels hopeful, doesn't it? Knowing that even in the face of such pain and adversity, there's potential for healing growth and even positive transformation.
I think so. The human spirit is incredibly resilient, and when we come together with empathy and understanding, we can create a world where healing is possible.
Yeah, it does feel hopeful. And as much as we've talked about the heavy stuff about trauma, this source also reminds us that healing isn't just about managing the symptoms or just coping, you know?
Right.
It could be about transforming and growing too.
Absolutely. It's that thrive stage we were talking about.
Exactly. And one of the things they highlight is this idea that thriving after trauma can mean finding a new sense of purpose.
It can.
Like maybe your priorities shift, or you connect more deeply with certain values.
Yeah.
Or maybe you even discover strengths and passions you never knew you had.
Exactly. Like the experience, as tough as it was, kind of opened up new possibilities.
New ways of seeing the world.
Yeah.
I remember reading about a study where trauma survivors talked about feeling more compassionate and empathetic after what they went through.
Oh.
Like they were able to connect with other people's pain on a deeper level because they had gone through something difficult themselves.
Well, that's such a powerful example of post-traumatic growth.
Right.
It's about finding meaning and purpose even in the experiences you would never wish on anyone.
Exactly. And the source also talks about how resilience isn't just something you build on your own. It's also about connection and support, having those relationships where you feel safe and understood.
Absolutely. Knowing you're not alone, that there are people who care and understand can make such a difference, especially when you're trying to heal.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from all of this?
I hope they leave with a sense of hope. Trauma can have a huge impact, but it doesn't have to define us. There's a path towards healing, and it often involves discovering a strength we never knew we had.
And I hope they remember that connection is so important, reaching out to others, building those supportive relationships, and creating those safe spaces where healing can happen.
Beautifully said. We all have a role to play in creating a more trauma-informed world, a world where healing is possible.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the complexities of trauma and the power of resilience. Until next time, keep exploring.